Anywho, my name is Geer. I am part of our Azure team covering federal for Microsoft right now. I'm one of our application innovation specialists. A lot of you, I think I've run into most of you before. I was actually our technical director for business applications, which include Power Platform and Dynamics for our federal group for the last 4 years. I recently moved, I guess I wasn't technical director the whole time, but I recently moved over to our Azure team this year to join our an application innovation group, which is really focused on developers. It's focused on cloud native applications, developer tools, DevSecOps. My background is I spent the first 15 years of my career as a software developer, software development leader, both as a contractor I worked for Lockheed Martin for a long time, so I worked in the federal space, and then also in the commercial sector for quite a while as well. And so this move a little bit back to those development roots, but Power Platform is still a big part of the story. So I labeled tonight's presentation. I know we're going to be talking about government. Most of this, honestly, is applicable to non-government as well. But since I'm doing it with my Microsoft Federal hoodie on, it's not government related. No, there's definitely some government nuance that will go in here for those of you who are working in the government sector. But for the most part, a lot of this, what I'm going to talk about is really using Power Platform and Azure and how you can get the benefits out of both of them. So with that, I'm going to go over, and again, some of this stuff, you're going to go, okay, yeah, I'm in the Power Platform, I get this, right? But at the end of the day, how do we start working with customers? I'm going to go back to my title slide, actually, because I label this like developing mission capabilities with Microsoft Tech. If you're in the commercial sector, maybe that's developing business capabilities or business applications. In the government sector, we typically, talk about mission capabilities, especially in the DoD space. And so when we look at it, right, it's only so many problems in that mission space can be solved with off-the-shelf SaaS or partner solutions, right? You've got some ERP systems, you've got HR systems, you've got some partner solutions in there, but it still leaves a whole lot of white space that organizations need to fill in the gaps with to be able to meet all the mission needs in their organization. And there's, so everything basically requires a tailored approach. And so when we look at that, right, we look at that from a few different angles. The punchline to this is we provide capabilities that allow you to look at, support lots of different scenarios, right? There's still a lot of organizations, especially in the federal space, where there's a lot of on-prem work still going on, net new development still going on on-prem. You know what? And you're talking Windows servers, Visual Studio, .NET, SQL Server. Azure Stack, if you guys have not looked at Azure Stack, take a look at Azure Stack. It's your own little slice of Azure running on some servers in your data center. So it gives you a lot of really neat capabilities to take advantage of if you're still in that on-prem world to a large degree. Then we start looking and saying, hey, there's other applications that what I call cloud migrated, right? Other people say it might be lift and shift. You've basically moved your application from on-prem and you dropped it on some VMs in the cloud. Application is basically the same, but you happen to be running in the cloud. Then kind of the next step, and maybe this is a few steps up the food chain, but it's talking about cloud native applications, right? Hey, I'm designing an application specifically to take advantage of the power of the cloud, right? You're talking in the Azure world, you're talking things like App Service, Cosmos DB, Azure SQL, Logic Apps, containers, service mesh, serverless capabilities, right? There's lots of capabilities in the cloud that if you're committed to the cloud, you can take advantage of to be able to make your application that much better. Going back to the first one, Azure Stack gives you some of that cloud native stuff on-prem as well. Kind of the fourth area, again, up the food chain even a little bit further, is low-code, right? This is where Power Apps, Power Automate, Power Virtual Agent, AI Builder, the Dynamics, applications, they fit in this realm as well. But what we all know is that at the end of the day, most of us are hybrid organizations, right? We're doing a little bit of all of this. Not everything is low-code. Maybe we'd love it to be, but there's applications that maybe are not good fits for low-code. Not everything is on-prem. We're using a little, most organizations are using a little bit of all of this as they go through, running their mission. And then underneath all of this, right, you've got different capabilities. You've got identity you got to worry about. You've got data services. You've got DevOps. Hopefully you're using DevOps even in the Power Platform and low-code space. You've got some sort of CI/CD pipeline that you're using to maintain your applications. So, like I said, usually we're living in this hybrid space. And so it's how do you use this technology in such a way to actually give you good results across, all of these stacks. All right. So one of the things that I'm going to talk a little bit about tonight is developer velocity. You're going to, okay, why are you talking about developer velocity? That's not, it's not a technology thing. But developer velocity is so important, right? And anytime that we start talking about, especially low code, how many times have you pitched low code to a customer, to your management, or to a customer and said, hey, the reason you want to go with low code is so that you can iterate quicker, you can do things faster. You're talking about developer velocity at that point, right? In the low code space, you might be referring to citizen developers, but you're ultimately talking about developer velocity, right? And how do we define developer velocity? It's really about being able to drive business performance, through software development, empowering developers, being able to do stuff faster. I kind of define it as being able to deliver mission capabilities more efficiently, right? We're getting into being able to deliver that mission capability. And it's not just about tools. There's a lot of stuff that goes into having a high developer velocity, right? Some of it's tools, some of it's technology, some of it's practices, right? It's some of it, and a lot of it's culture. It's how does the organization work together? What's allowed? How much, what's the structure look like? Is the structure set up to be agile? If it's not set up to be agile, then having a bunch of really great tools that allow you to move fast might not actually result in you moving quickly. It might just result in you moving slowly with new tools, right? And so when you start looking at developer velocity, and anyone who's been around this industry for a while understands this, is that you've got to look at the holistic systems, around culture, people, processes, technology, tools. How does it all fit together, and how do we make the right selections with the right culture and the right teams and the right processes to get the best result? I can't solve culture, that's every organization, but what I can talk about is tools. And from a Microsoft perspective, when we look at that, we don't say, hey, if you want high developer velocity, just go use Power Apps or just go use X, Y, and Z. We believe that it's actually a combination of a lot of capabilities that's going to give you the best result at the end of the day. And so, from a developer perspective, we look at this with Power Apps obviously being a key component of it, but also Visual Studio, GitHub, and Azure all being key components into ultimately putting together an organization and a development process that allows you to achieve, a high developer velocity, being able to deliver those mission applications. And part of the reason is when we look at this, it's all about using the right tool for the right job. As I kind of stated earlier, not everything is a good fit for low code. If we were in the room, I'd have you raise your hands, but we've all seen it, right? You get someone coming into the room, you're in the middle of a low code project, someone comes into the room and says, hey, I solved that problem we were talking about. And 3 whiteboards later, 2 pots of coffee, they've explained what they did to make it work in the low code tool, and you're not even sure, that you're even in the low code tool anymore, right? They've got, 37 different JavaScripts on, all these different pages you have to go through in the right order, and it's fragile, and it's, it's error prone. It technically was done in low code, but was it the right solution, right? And so we always, I hear a lot of people ask the question of, can we do it? And a lot of times the answer is yes. But do we always ask that right question of, should we do it, right? Should we do it that way, or is there a better way to look at it? And so when we, when I work with a customer, when we talk with customers about delivering a capability, it's looking at it from that mission aspect. Great, what are you looking to achieve? What are the requirements of that? And then it's applying the right tools to the right chunks of that to achieve that result in the best way. Very rarely, and you guys, Jim, and some of you I've known for a long time, I've always said this: there is no such thing as a Power Apps deal when it comes to working with a customer. No one ever just buys Power Apps and is done. It's it's always on a spectrum of Power Apps to, I don't know what the opposite of low code is. What's the opposite of low code? It's, it's not high code, but non-low code development to low code development. Code first development, I guess, is what the slide says. I should read my slide. So when we look at code first development, there's a spectrum here. And when you look at delivering a mission capability, odds are you're not at either end of it. You're somewhere along the spectrum, mixing the best of both worlds to get to get the end result. So with that, let's talk a little bit about where can you have Power Apps and Azure work really well together. And then, like I said, a lot of this is going to be generic, just with Power Apps and Azure. But at the end, we'll get into some of the government-specific nuances to how some of this fits together. And so when we look at the integrations, this is a great example. So this is something that we talk about with customers, and we look at this around building APIs. Right, and being able to publish APIs in a consistent way with an organization, because a lot of times, if I'm an organization, we were talking about, some of the transportation earlier, right? If I want to publish an API in a transportation organization, and I want to be able to expose that to maybe my developers, maybe external developers who want to integrate with my organization. I want to do that in a way that makes sense and a way that's consistent. But my backend might be a whole mix of different systems. I might have an old mainframe system, some new web apps, some stuff in CDS or Dataverse, and a whole collection of other stuff that ultimately builds, that is all a part of my enterprise capability that I need to expose out to an organization, out to a set of developers. And so with that, how do you do that in a consistent way? Well, option one is you could just rewrite it all on a single platform and then have a consistent interface. Probably not the best option, because that's going to take years and you never get done probably. But how can you expose that in a little bit of an easier way? So looking at something like API Gateway in Azure, allows you to put I'll say a facade in front of your backend systems and build and define what your external API looks like. And again, it could be external or internal, but you're exposing an API. So you're able to say, hey, I want my API to look like this, and define what the methods are, how the data gets passed back and forth. And then you're able to then proxy that to one or more backend systems. And those backend systems could be direct. So this picture shows the API gateway talking directly to a REST web service. Great. It could also be talking to something like a logic app that has an HTTP endpoint that is then, when someone calls that endpoint, is going out to do orchestration to reach out to various backend services, collect data, and pull it together and use that collected data to respond to that API call. There's lots of different ways that you could build that, but it gives you the ability to, curate an API that makes sense for your end users. And then maybe over time, you're going to refactor the backend. Great. Again, refactoring that is now abstracted from your end users because they're using your API gateway. The other great there's some other great benefits of that are, looking at it from the perspective of standardizing security. You can have security offloaded in your API gateway so that, when people log in, they log in, and then, that user principal can then be passed to your backend systems. You don't have to have a different, OAuth token for every single service out there or whatever it might be. And another thing to look at too with this is, a developer portal, right? You're able to actually expose your APIs in a developer-friendly way so they can do things like testing against it and building, against maybe some non-production data or whatever it might be. And so this is a standard pattern that we talk to a lot of customers about, with API Gateway and some of our other capabilities. But how does that play into Power Platform? Right. Well, one way it can play into Power Platform is that you could have CDS as one of the systems on the back end, right? CDS has a full RESTful API that's associated with it. And you could expose, and actually we have customers doing this today, some of our biggest customers, is they are putting an API gateway in front of Dataverse and exposing subsets of Dataverse through the API gateway in a curated way, because they want to they want to expose some of it, but not necessarily all of it, to to end consumers. And so they're doing it that way. Or you could put it behind a logic app if you want another layer of abstraction in there. But the scenario where we see it maybe more frequently used is on the other end, where the Power App is on the front of it. So let me get to that in a second. So when we start talking about Power Apps, how does Power Apps specifically, I'll say, engage with Azure and and I'll say the code first world? Some of the areas, API management, we just talked about, so we'll get into a little bit more details on that in a second. Another one of the areas is CI/CD pipelines, right? When you're talking about delivering a mission capability, and that mission capability requires low-code components, because you want to do a really cool Canvas app, or you want to do a model app that deals with some of the data, but it also requires maybe some analytical analytical capabilities, some stuff from a data lake. It's going to require some backend, some ML capabilities, stuff that you're not necessarily going to do in low code. You're bridging the world between code first and low code. But what you don't want to do is you don't want to have two completely different deployment methodologies. You don't want to have two completely different DevOps pipelines. You want to be able to find a way to consolidate that, so when you roll out your application, you're rolling it out as an application, not as 2 or 3 or 4 distinct applications that all need to be coordinated and done correctly. And so baking Power Platform into your CI/CD pipeline is an important, step. Even if you're just using Power Apps by themselves, I still think that that's an important step. And then the last piece, we won't go into this much tonight, but one other area that we see a lot of extension into the Azure realm is Power Virtual Agents. So Power Virtual Agents, I guess it's been out a little while in the commercial era. It is just coming to our government customers. I think this month or next month. So it'll be in some of our government clouds here very soon. And with that, it opens up a whole new world, and not only can you do Power Virtual Agents, but then you're able to extend it with bot framework. So again, you mixing the best of both worlds, where you get low code virtual agent development, but you can extend it into bot framework skills that might be code first. All right. So back to the API management for a second. Again, everyone, who's seen microservices or heard of microservices, right? Everyone's heard of microservices. If you've been in the IT industry for the last 5, maybe even longer years, you've talked about microservices, right? Taking monolithic applications, breaking them down into smaller components, and deploying those smaller components in independent ways. You go and you look at a lot of the, I'll say, the cloud native big applications out there. You see, like, the Netflix of the world, or whoever it might be, and they talk about, hey, we deploy 500 times a day. Great, because their applications are broken down into microservices, and each of those microservices is deployed in an independent way. They're coordinated so that they know what the dependencies are between them, but they're deployed, they've got their own release schedule, right? Service A and Service B don't have to necessarily release on the same day, as long as they don't break the interface between the two. A lot of those microservices, run on top of Kubernetes or K8s, right? They run on top of container frameworks. And so this is another area that we see a lot of benefit with Power Apps and code first architectures working together, and a lot of our customers getting benefit from this. Is maybe you've got a lot of complex work, or maybe you've just got existing capabilities that are containerized, right? You've got a bunch of microservices in your organization that are being used. And this example shows, hey, I'm building it. I'm using Kubernetes, Azure Kubernetes Service. Maybe my data is stored in Cosmos DB, but then I want to expose that to the world again. Well, Power Apps is just a potential consumer of any of your APIs. And a way to do that is, again, with API management. Put an API management node in front of it, have it point back to all of your microservices and collate and curate those microservices into a consistent API, and then expose that API to the world, which then something like Power Apps can consume. This one says, hey, a Power Apps and team, but it could be a Canvas app. It could be any type of Power App. Through a custom connector, or just through the HTTP connector, it could reach out to that API and be able to ingest that data and interact with that API in a consistent way. And so, it doesn't require you to rebuild and move all of your data out of Cosmos and into, Dataverse, or redo all of your business logic. It just requires you to expose it. I know earlier we talked a lot, a little bit about, different connectors and how it all fits together. A lot of the stuff we're talking about here is assuming premium connectors, right? You're able to build a Power App that talks over the HTTP connector, uses a custom connector. I don't have slides on custom connectors, but now I kind of feel like I should. If everyone, looks at custom connectors, go look it up. It's basically the ability to just like in Power Apps, where you're able to say, hey, I want to use a SharePoint connector and drag it in, and then be able to look at lists and add an item to a list and query a list. You've got all those functions through that SharePoint connector. A custom connector lets you do the same thing with some sort of API backend. And so if I had an API here, we'll call this my account management API. If I had my account management API here, that's exposed through a RESTful API, I could build a custom connector in Power Apps that just points to that API and API management. And then now my Power Apps have a connector that just knows how to talk, and deal with accounts, create accounts, delete accounts, list accounts, search accounts, do whatever those functions are without my Power Apps developers having to understand the API directly itself. So if you haven't looked at custom connectors, definitely take a look at that, especially if you're trying to bridge that gap between low code and code first. All right, I just went through a lot. Does anyone have any questions before I keep going into this? I'm going to change tacks a little bit here.
Is there a time frame at all right now for Dataverse for Teams and GCC?
That is a good question that I do not know the answer for. Let me see who's on this list.
I actually just saw an announcement come across this week, Chris. Let me see if I can pull something up. I don't know if it's public yet or not.
Perfect. Yeah, I just saw you. I was about to call you out. Thank you for volunteering, Derek. So, Rick, I think that was you. Well, let Derek will take a look and see if we have a date on that. I don't know the date off the top of my head.
Cool. Appreciate it.
All right. You guys are going easy on me. All right. So, another area when we start talking about integration with, code first and low code, it really comes around. And again, this is something I think you should do anyways. But I want to talk a minute about, again, this is, this enterprise DevOps software factories. This is something that we talk a lot about with customers, primarily around like the Kubernetes area, right? How do you have a container infrastructure, and how do you build a process to successfully build, deploy, manage, monitor, secure, and operate applications inside of a Kubernetes cluster, for example. But the same concepts actually apply to Power Platform. And so I want to talk a little bit about that. And so when we start talking about, a software factory, really what we're talking about is a standard stack of developer tools that can be deployed in an automated and integrated way on Azure. In this case, really we're talking about the Microsoft Cloud as whole, but as you guys know, ultimately Power Apps runs on Azure. And so, it's really about running this on the cloud. And again, these principles, the benefits, right, go straight to migration, development, and innovation. Less worry about tool selection, setup, management, full observability and governance with 24/7 monitoring. Those are things that don't only apply to code first environments. Those are things that apply to low code as well. And if you haven't figured that out in the low code world, you'll eventually figure out why you need to figure it out, right? Because even in the low code world, as low code applications scale, you run into the same challenges. You run into the same challenges with monitoring and management and governance and security, and being able to really track and understand, okay, who made that change? Where did that data come from? Do you have audit logs turned on, right? How do you get to that? How do you correlate someone making a change in Dataverse back to a login that's tracked in Active Directory? How do you bridge that stuff together? And so when we look at a software factory, we ultimately look at it from a set of layers. And these are the layers that we look at. So, it starts on the outside with orchestration and logging, security, collaboration and planning, dev, build, test, and observability, right? So those are the different layers that we talk about in the software factory. And on this next slide, we're going to break down each of them and talk about tooling. So with a Power, if you're looking at this, with a Kubernetes software factory, you're going to have a lot more options on here for different tools. With Power Platform, it's a little bit simpler because Microsoft, the Power Platform itself, actually provides the capabilities just as part of the platform for several of these, like orchestration. Great, you got solution packages, you've got the ability to create environments. That is done inside the Power Platform. Logging, again, you've got, the audit logs as part of Dataverse. You've got logs that are part of Power Automate and Power Apps. Again, it's all kind of baked into the platform itself along with security. Observability as well, right? Being able to see your metrics and stuff, again, all kind of baked into the platform. Where you have some choice is in Ring 3 and Ring 4. So collaboration and planning, and then build, dev, and test. Right, in these areas, you're really looking at, so Ring 3, we're really talking about how do you plan your build? Where's your product backlog? How does that fit together? How do you communicate, what's your consistent way to communicate across your dev team and your stakeholders? There's lots of tools. I know in the federal space, Geer is one of the big tools in this space that's used by most organizations out there. It's a very popular tool. I've used it for many years. If you're looking for, hey, a Microsoft solution to, for collaboration and planning, we recommend GitHub and Teams, right? The combination of those. So you could also use Azure DevOps. We typically talk more about GitHub these days, but Azure DevOps would fit into that category as well, right? GitHub with issue tracking and being able to, do that, and then Teams for collaboration, for sites, for file shares and everything, to track, what you're doing. Probably the more interesting one is more in the build, dev, and test ring, where you're really talking about source control and CI/CD pipelines. GitHub is kind of the 800-pound gorilla when it comes to source control. A lot of organizations are using GitHub. There's still a lot of TFS. There's still a lot of TFS Azure DevOps. There's some GitLab out there. A lot of GitHub for source control. And for CI/CD, you see a good mixture, right? GitHub Actions. If you haven't played with GitHub Actions yet, I encourage you to take a look at it. We're going to talk about that on the next step, on the next slide a little bit. But there's a lot of Jenkins. There's a lot, there's some more specific tools out there as well. But there's a lot of options for how you orchestrate your CI/CD pipeline. And the important thing is that even with Power Apps, if I go back to the slide, actually, with Power Apps, you're not locked into using GitHub. If you want to use GitLab and Jenkins, you can do that in Jira. You're free to do that, whatever works for your process. The more important thing is that you've got a process, that you've got a set of tools that make sense for you in this area, right? And so I'm going to talk a little bit about ALM and just, again, really from the point of view that when you start building mission systems that bridge that gap between low code and code first, having your low code capability baked into an ALM strategy is just going to make it just part of the overall system, much more. And so everyone on here probably knows this, so I won't spend a lot of time on this. Solutions are important to Power Apps, right? That is your deployable unit. In dev, you build your app, you export your solution, you want to generate a managed solution, and then promote that up the stack as a managed solution into test and prod. And then hopefully everything is in the solution. I know historically, you couldn't put everything in the solution. That is quickly evolving. Now you can have Canvas apps and chatbots and your model-driven apps and all sorts of stuff. Some of the new stuff that's even new since since I left the team, environment variables, connection references, and stuff. You're even able to make them even more configurable now. And when we look at it from this perspective, is what does ALM look like with Power Apps? And this is a simplified kind of view of ALM, right? Build, test, and release. That when you're going to be baking your low-code solutions into a CI/CD pipeline, what does it look like? Well, in build, this is all about the developer. And I'm not going to get into, hey, should I have, one environment where all my developers working or one environment per developer? That's almost a religious conversation that we'll avoid here. But, from a developer perspective, you're going to get an environment. You're going to deploy whatever your baseline solutions are. You're going to make your changes. You're going to make those changes in a solution, right? You're going to have a solution that you're working in. You're going to make those changes. And then ultimately, you're going to export that solution from your dev environment. You're going to unpack it. And then, when you unpack that zip file, it's going to be a whole bunch of, individual files. That is what you check into source control. So now you're able to source control all of your changes that go with your application. And then if all of your developers are doing that, you're at the end of the day, you have in source control, you've got your final application. Then when it comes to test, right? I am a big believer in continuous integration, even for low code. We did this, we've done this a lot, is get a test server. one of the things is take a look at GitHub, GitHub Actions. There's actually a Power Platform library for GitHub Actions. So all of these circles on here, like unpacking and packing and importing and exporting, those are pre-built GitHub Actions that you can just use in your workflows. There's also versions of those for Azure DevOps if you're still using Azure DevOps. There's some third-party, there's some open source libraries out there that allow you to do that. To do those same things. So you don't need to manually build all this stuff yourself. You can use some of the stuff that either we provide or the open source community provides to do that. But in your in your CI pipeline, right, you're going to check out from source control. You're going to have some sort of triggers like on a check-in or on a timer. Maybe you do it at night, and then you're going to run unit tests. Yes, you need unit tests, right? All of your JavaScript, all of your plugins, you're going to have unit tests against those. Run the unit tests against them. You're going to pack that solution as a managed solution. And I know, again, we're getting to a religious war between unmanaged and managed, but the best practice is to use a managed solution for several reasons. You get a managed solution, run Solution Checker on it. There's something, if you guys have looked at Solution Checker, it's a great tool. Solution Checker is now available through the command line and through the GitHub Actions, so you can run it offline against a solution offline, which is great. Then you're going to import that solution into a test environment. And then you're going to run integration tests. What do I mean by integration tests? That's going to be, maybe you've got integration tests that go against the Dataverse API because you want to test to make sure that your server-side rules function properly. Or better yet, you're using something like Easy Repro, which is a Selenium extension, built for Power Platform and Dynamics that lets you more easily build interactive user tests against your Power App, primarily model apps. I haven't looked lately to see if they've added Canvas app capability into it, but I know it's worked with model apps for a while. And so that way you can have integration tests that go against your UI and simulate what a user interacting with your system will be. I'll be honest with you, it's a fair amount of work to do that, but the payoff is massive. You immediately know if you broke something, if you've done your integration tests well. Several of my customers have implemented these over the years, and they've complained up front because it's a lot of work to do it. But then 6 months later, they're just singing the benefits of it because it saved them tons of rework time because they realized early that something they did broke their system. And then ultimately, assuming all of that passes, you're going to publish that managed solution out to some sort of package repro. And then when you get to your release, if you're doing continuous release, cool. If you're doing automated release, that works too. If you're doing manual release, okay, at least you've got the package. But when you start talking about an automated release, you push your button and then it has a place to pull that package from and then deploy that into production and then run some sort of deployment tests. Quite frankly, when I talk with organizations about low code that happen to be code first organizations that are looking like low code, one of their biggest complaints and drawbacks, or one of their biggest, I'll say, stumbling blocks and arguments not to embrace low code is because they don't believe it'll integrate into their DevOps pipeline. But it does. And so there's a little bit of education there. It's good to do anyways, but it's really good to do, especially if you're working on applications that bridge that gap. All right. Let me see, Derek. Okay, looks like Derek answered that question in chat. Any questions about that before I move on to some of the government nuances here? Okay. I've officially put everyone to sleep. Excellent. All right, so what are the nuances for some of this stuff with government? If you've worked with Power Apps or Office in government, you've heard these terms, GCC, GCC High, DoD. So from a Microsoft perspective, we actually have, we'll call them distinct clouds for our government customers. So we have our public cloud, which is available for everybody. And you can see that on the left there. We've got Office, we've got Dynamics, we've got Power Platform. Active Directory is, Active Directory, it's Azure Active Directory Public or Azure Active Directory Commercial that powers that along with our EMS suite. When you start getting into the government space though, you've actually got, at the moment, 3 clouds. We'll hopefully have more clouds to the right of this in the future. But right now we've got 3 clouds that we talk about a lot. And this is important to know what cloud are you working in, or what cloud is your customer working in, because that's going to impact a lot of your decisions and just how you want to look at things moving forward. So GCC, GCC stands for Government Community Cloud. And so we have an Office 365 GCC, a Dynamics GCC, and a Power Platform GCC. One of the things you're going to notice is that Active Directory thing. GCC actually uses Azure Active Directory Commercial, but it's built on top of Azure Government. And that causes some interesting nuances that we'll get to in a second. And then moving up the stack, so GCC, that's going to be your baseline cloud for governments, whether that be local governments, tribal governments, federal government, civilian governments. Most organizations in the government space use GCC. It's FedRAMP High compliant. It has it has things like CGIS. It's got some of the other stuff that goes along that a lot of government agencies care about. But it's still, I'll say, relatively open and gets capability. It has most commercial capabilities in it in a relatively short time frame. When we start to move up the stack, we start to get into higher compliance. So GCC High, this is primarily targeted at system integrators, defense contractors, some government agencies that have to worry about specialized certifications. So specifically things around ITAR. So if you've got export control data, GCC High is usually where you're going to wind up. And again, you've got all the products in there. They're just in the GCC High stack. And then we also have our DoD stack, as you can imagine, that is dedicated to our DoD customers so that they have their own dedicated space where they can work together in that area. The biggest thing to note when we start talking about integration with Azure is that first big blue line, whether or not it's using Azure Active Directory or Azure Active Directory for Government. Because that is where your identity is, and that is going to impact a lot of decisions that you've got moving down the road. With all four of these are what we call our SaaS stacks, or this is our SaaS applications. All four of these these customers can choose to either use Azure Public or Azure Government. So I know that we're starting to mess with the laws of physics, I think, at this point. But I can have a customer in GCC that uses Azure Commercial, and it works fine. In fact, most of our civilian governments use GCC plus Azure Commercial, and it actually works really well because the common denominator is Azure Active Directory Commercial. So GCC, all their SaaS applications, the identity for that is in commercial, and any of their Azure work is done in commercial. So they share the same identity store. And that works out really well. Same thing on this side, right? If you're in GCC High or DoD, you're probably going to be an Azure Government customer, because that way your SaaS applications and your Azure applications share the same identity store. But it doesn't always work out that way, which is why it's important for you to ask and important for you to know. Because we have a fair number of GCC customers who use Azure Government. And they do that for very good reasons, because Azure Government, while Azure Public is FedRAMP High, there are some certifications that it doesn't have, like CGIS, for example. So if you care about CGIS, GCC might be fine, but you would also need to use Azure Government. And so in that case, again, it works and you're able to integrate the two, but you've actually got two different identity stores at that point, which is, again, it's not an insurmountable issue. It's just something that you need to be aware of, because it's going to come into play a little bit later. Another thing, when you start talking about the government space, is, I'm not going to go through all the connectors, but if you guys use Power Platform, you know about all the connectors. One of the most important things that if you're looking in the government space is to look at this top section of a connector page. So this is just the Azure Blob Storage connector from our documentation. And at the very top of every connector, it calls out what regions is it available in. Most of them say this, all, right? And so that's good. That means that this connector is available in all regions. So Azure Public, Azure, GCC, GCC High, Azure Government, whatever it might be. Where you need to be careful is like Azure IoT Central v3. This is available in all regions except the following. So you can see that for logic apps, this connector is not in Azure Government, and for Power Apps and Power Automate, this connector is not in GCC and not in GCC High. It's also not in DoD. They just haven't updated the documentation yet to include the DoD cloud because it's pretty new. And so again, government nuance, when you're looking at this, just be, that's something always good to look at is the connector that I want to use in the cloud that I am operating in? One other thing, one other nuance is, like I said, if I go back to this slide for a second, like I said, for customers that are in GCC, their identity, they very well might be using Azure Commercial. And again, a lot of our customers do, but something that everyone should know is that all of our government clouds here for Power Platform, all three of these actually run on Azure Government. So Power Platform GCC runs on top of Azure Government. It runs in our subscription, but it runs on top of Azure Government. And that's important for one reason, is that there are certain connectors in GCC that only work with Azure Government. This list might be a little dated. And so, this stuff is changing all of the time, but this is the latest information that I had. And the reason that they only work with Azure Government is since Power Platform is built in Azure Government, if you look at these connectors, so we'll pick on blob storage, all it asks you for is a storage account name. Well, it makes the assumption that that storage account is in Azure Government because Power Platform is running in Azure Government. And so it doesn't provide you with a way to say, no, you need to go look in Azure Commercial for that storage account. I know that they're working on making this more flexible, but again, it's just something to be aware of, that there are some connectors that if the connector doesn't let you specify a full connection string or doesn't let you specify which cloud it wants to connect to, just test it out and see and make sure that it works in your environment, because some of them, make an assumption about what environment you are trying to talk to. All right. Again, I'll pause. I'm going to take a drink. Any questions about some of the government nuances?
Hey, Chris. This is Aiden.
Hey.
What are some of the main reasons that there are lags between features and not necessarily connectors, but just general, platform features between commercial and then GCC and working its way through? And do you think that lag will decrease in the future? Sure.
So as you can imagine, there's lots of potential reasons. Let me start with the end of your question. Do I anticipate that getting better? Yes, I do. In fact, it has gotten significantly better over the past 12 months. And I do think that it is going to get better. And the reason that it's getting better is actually a fix for the cause or for the reason that I'm going to give of why it's taken a while is feature teams. So in our engineering group, as you can imagine, we have a large engineering team across Microsoft. And there's lots of independent teams working on different features. Historically, a lot of the feature teams, they build for commercial and then figure out how to migrate it to some of the higher clouds, especially when a lot of these government clouds were relatively new. It made sense to do it that way. And when they did that, sometimes, again, not saying all the time, but sometimes a design decision was made to use a Azure capability that they found out didn't exist, like in Azure Government, right? They used a feature that only existed in commercial. And so that might block it from going into Azure Government. Sometimes it's compliance, right? There's some extra compliance steps that it has to go through. But a lot of the times it has to do with, I'll say, dependencies that aren't in Azure Government or or other feature dependencies that might not be in those higher clouds. So, and the reason I say that I think it's going to get better is that I know that there's an initiative underway for feature teams that during the design process, they are more actively considering what's in the higher clouds as they make their design decisions. So if they could choose to use, capability A or capability B, but capability A is in Azure Government, but capability B is not, they're going to, now they're informed to make the choice to use capability B so that their feature can more easily move up the chain. While I'll say previously, they might not have been aware that it wasn't there. So people are more aware these days.
Okay. All right. Excellent. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions? All right. I know I probably talked for way too long, so I'm going to wrap it up here in just a second. But there's one more thing that I want to talk about, which is a cool feature. And again, this doesn't necessarily only apply to government, but it has a unique application in government that I think is really useful. And Logic App ISE. So I think most people are probably aware what Logic Apps are. If you're not, picture Power Automate. Power Automate is actually built on top of Logic Apps. So Logic Apps is the underlying service that actually powers Power Automate. And so it's more of it is kind of a low-code capability in Azure, but it has, it's not a citizen developer friendly for sure, and it has a different pricing model. But Logic Apps, think of it very much like Power Automate. It's a way to build automation and flows that allow you to run. And an ISE is a special capability that allows you to run. Actually, let me take a step back. When you look at Power Automate or Logic Apps is a PaaS service, Power Automate is a SaaS service. When you deploy one of those, they run on our infrastructure, right? So if you're deploying a Power Automate, that runs on the multi-tenant SaaS infrastructure. It's isolated and your data is protected and everything, but it's running on the multi-tenant shared infrastructure for the cloud that you're in. And ISE lets you take the Logic Apps capability and deploy it into your private network in Azure. So in Azure, you can have things called virtual networks, which is your private network in Azure, where you have endpoints, where you have private IP addresses to access your services. So Logic Apps ISE actually lets you take the Logic Apps runtime and run it in a private instance of that in your private network in Azure, which is really cool for a lot of reasons. But let's go back to this slide for a second. We talked about this earlier. We have Logic Apps over here. So what we're saying is instead of having your Logic App that you're running in the PaaS layer, so the multi-tenant layer, it's going to be running in a dedicated environment in your virtual network. Why would you want to do that? I just copied this from the docs. I'm not going to drain this. You can look at it. But honestly, one of the most important things, the most important one is probably security. But one of the most important things to look at, and one of the biggest benefits, is direct access to resources that are inside or connected to your virtual network. That also means on-premise stuff if a customer is using Logic or using ExpressRoute or a VPN connection. So now, instead of having to use the on-premise data gateway and have your flow running in the SaaS layer, but using the gateway to connect to on-prem or to Azure, you're actually running your Logic App in this case on a private node that has direct access to your private network and all of your private resources. As you can imagine, there's security implications of that. There's performance implications of that. There's a lot of benefits that go with being able to do that. And so just from a general perspective, this is something really cool and something that you should look at if you have, if you run into a lot of scenarios where you need to run automations against, I'll say, private data. But also, especially in the government space, where where there's, I'll say, more concerns about some data privacy, more concerns about some regulations. There's a lot of rules out there about isolation and requirements for isolation, and so this gives you the ability to use Logic Apps, which might not be approved at a government organization, without an ability to isolate it in this way. And then again, direct access to that. Those private resources is critical as well. But the other reason I bring it up, and I bring it up on this call, is that it then lets you do this model, right? Where I've got Logic Apps running in a private environment. I can also deploy API gateway into my virtual network, and then I can expose my API gateway in such a way that then Power Apps can then talk to it. Especially if you have your Power Apps set up in such a way that it can talk across ExpressRoute or whatever, you'd be able to get to that, or at the very least, you'd be able to expose your gateway in such a way, in a more secure way than you would necessarily your logic app or your function. So this is a great model to be able to expose data to Power Apps that you might not otherwise have access to expose. This is also actually a scenario that lets you bridge the gap between like Azure Commercial and Azure Government. Because you're able to run a logic app maybe in Azure Government and then expose it in such a way that something running in Azure Commercial could then consume, for example, if you need to bridge the gap between those two. And that is the end of my slides. So I will open it up for questions, or I think I ran a little bit long, so we can, Kylie, I'll turn it back over to you.